right, hello everybody. So today we are looking at the colonial period in this lecture. And one thing for us to keep in mind as we go through this period is to remember that the concept of colonization and imperialism, the underlying principle of this is that the colony exists to support the empire. So whatever the colony has, the empire goes in and then extracts what it needs. This is the underlying principle of colonization. It's not the other way around where the empire serves to or exists to serve the colony and to go in and improve the colony and to help the colony. This is the justification for imperialization, but and it's usually couched in terms of, well, the imperialist state is going into the colony in order to help it because it is backwards and in need of modernization and of help. But that's not actually what happens, and that's not the reality. But the reality is that these imperialist states, they go out and they colonize other areas because they need those areas and they need resources to extract from those areas. And so that's what they do in order to increase the power of the imperialist state and of the empire. So this is the basic principle that we need to keep in mind when we think about the colonial period. And once we understand that this is indeed how colonization, how colonies and empires work, then it actually makes logical sense when we see how Japan went into Korea and the kind of actions that they exhibited during this time. All right, so let's take a look at the colonial period. This was a period from 1910 to 1945, and during this time, there were some fluctuations in the policies. So when the Japanese first came in, they essentially established a police state because there was quite a bit of resistance to the Japanese. As you recall, historically, the Koreans had looked down on Japan as this barbaric state. They called them the Eastern Barbarians. And so it was very strange for them to have this barbarian state now come in and be the overlords. So they established a police state in the beginning, but because of the resistance to this, they had to adjust their policy. So then beginning in 1920 and throughout the 20s, there was a softer, what we call cultural policy that the Japanese implemented. But then beginning in the 1930s, as Japan then began preparing and increasing their military state, and also as they began participating more in World War II, then we begin to see increasing militarism in the colonies in Korea as well. So we see these fluctuations. The overall political structure of the colonial state was that at the very top of power, we have the governor general. And the governor general could act like a virtual dictator. This is because, unlike in Japan, where in Japan the political structure, you have a national parliament where policies are discussed and need to be agreed upon before they get final approval from the emperor. The governor general of Korea could bypass the national parliament and go directly to the emperor. And so because the governor general reported directly to the emperor, this made him a virtual dictator. He could essentially behave however he wanted to behave. And so what we have then developing during the colonial period is this bureaucratic structure, which begins with about 10,000 bureaucrats. And by 1937, it expands to 87,000 bureaucrats. So the colonial state in Korea included 87,000 bureaucrats, and this does not include the colonial police force, which by the late 1930s included about 60,000 policemen. If we compare this to the Joseon dynasty, so as we discussed in previous lectures, the Joseon dynasty also had a centralized bureaucratic government, but at its height, the Joseon dynasty had about 6,000 bureaucrats. So if you compare this to 87,000 bureaucrats plus 60,000 police, this is a much, much larger bureaucratic structure with more bureaucrats, and it is much more invasive than what Koreans have ever seen, because it goes down to the local level, to the local government, and monitors daily activities of the villagers. And so because the Koreans are not used to having this kind of a widespread, pervasive, and powerful structure, this takes some getting used to for the Koreans. So the Japanese policy during the colonial period is that they want to develop the economy and they want to incorporate the Korean economy into the international market as well as into the Japanese imperial economy, but they'll only develop it in ways that are beneficial to the Japanese empire. Everything else can be left to function as they function, as long as it doesn't impede Japanese colonial policy. So, for example, they maintain the landlord-tenant system. This is a feudal system. And so you have these class differences between landlords and peasants. But they maintain that system because it's not in the interest of the Japanese colonial state to change it. So what we see happening is that we have this partial economic development and modernization that occurs simultaneously with the maintenance of feudal aspects from the Joseon dynasty. And so this becomes like a contradictory policy or contradictory development. And this eventually does very little to overall improve Korea. So the socioeconomic structure during the colonial period was we see the promotion of industry and certain kinds of industry that again are beneficial to the overall Japanese imperial economy. When the Japanese first come in order to develop the economy, you need infrastructure. So you need transportation, you need roads, you need railroads, you need communication. So they develop telegraphs and telephones, and you need a banking system. So the colonial state comes in and they start establishing all of these different areas. And so this is when we begin to see the beginning of economic development and the infrastructure for economic development, because this is what is necessary for the Japanese colonial state to develop the colonial economy and to incorporate it into the Japanese economy. So during the 1920s and the 30s, we see a push towards industrialization. There's both light industry and heavy industry. Light industry and these companies are owned by both Korean and Japanese companies, but heavy industries such as steel, these are all owned by Japanese companies. And if we take a closer look at the economic development during this time, so if you look at the railroads that the colonial state developed, these run in a largely north-south direction, so connecting the port of Busan with Seoul or Incheon, or connecting Busan with Wonsan, which is this area over in the northeastern region of Korea. Now, why do these run in the north-south direction? Well, this is because this is what the colonial state needed. So Busan being the main port of trade down here and the closest to Japan. So they needed to get resources and supplies quickly transferred up to Seoul, to Pyongyang, and then also up to Wonsan. It is not in the interest of the colonial state to build east-west running railroad lines, so they didn't build them. It would have been nice for the Korean population to have these east-west running lines, but because this was not what was necessary for economic development from the Japanese perspective, they didn't do it. There's also industrial development, and industrial development was focused in this northeastern region of Korea, so in the northeastern provinces of the peninsula. Again, this is because of its proximity to Japan. So we see that it takes place on the eastern coast, and if we go across here, the Japanese islands that lie over here to the east, and so there's easy proximity that connects the two. So we see that industry is developed in this area up here. Management in these industrial complexes, there were strict limitations for Koreans. Mostly Koreans were limited to the lowest levels of workers and manual laborers, whereas the higher positions of management, these were largely confined to Japanese. So we see that there are limitations in how far, if you're Korean, that you can advance and be promoted. So the rural economy, because Korea has very important arable land, land that does not exist on the Japanese islands, they wanted to use this land in order to develop the rice economy and rice production. So from 1910, from the very first year that the Japanese come in and colonize Korea, they conduct a countrywide land survey in Korea. You have to know what land is available, what land is arable. So they conduct a land survey. And all owners needed to claim and prove title to that land. They needed to show proof that they had a right to ownership of that land. Now, if you're a large landowner, usually that means that you were previously a yangban. And if you were given land by the government as your stipend for being a government official, then proving title was not a problem because you had documentation that the Joseon dynasty had given you this land and you had the rights to collect rent and to farm the land. So you turn that over to the Japanese colonial authorities, no problem. But let's say that you're a tenant farmer. You do not own the land. Or let's say that you're a small farmer. and your farm is adjacent to a large piece of land that's owned by a young bud. And it's just sort of become tradition over many, many generations during the Joseon Dynasty that, okay, this family has always farmed this land, and so they will continue to pass it down to their children, and they will continue to farm the land. But there is no official documentation of this. It's just maybe a verbal agreement or an agreement that is understood and that has existed over several generations. So when the Japanese come along in 1910 and the colonial authorities say, okay, where is your proof that you have the right to farm this land? Well, they don't have it. So what happens? The Japanese confiscate it, and it is turned over to the Japanese imperial state. And so a lot of these small farmers ended up losing their right to farm the land. And whereas we have these large landowners that have their large tracts of land that are kept intact. So we have quite a bit of land that is turned over to the Japanese, but the largest amount of land and the largest losers of land that's turned over to the Japanese colonial state is the Korean royal family. Because after 1910, there is no more a Korean king, right? It's just Korea now is a part of the Japanese Empire. And the Japanese start to integrate the Korean royal family. They send many of them over to Japan, and they intermarry with Japanese or members of the Japanese imperial family. And so then the Korean royal family eventually just sort of disappears. And the Japanese state, the colonial state, then takes over these royal lands, lands formerly owned or occupied by the Korean royal family. And so as a result, during the colonial period, the Japanese become the largest landowner in Korea. All right, so as mentioned, this feudal landlord-tenant system was maintained because you have still these very large tracts of lands owned by these wealthy landlords, and they need peasants to farm the land for them. We see that this system is maintained. It's not in the interest of the colonial state to change it. And in fact, what happens through the colonial period is that there's an expansion of growth for these landlords, because as these lands are developed for rice production, and as they use more modern agricultural technology, and as the Korean rice market is integrated into the Japanese colonial economy and the greater international rice market, they start reaping a lot of profits for themselves. And so landlords, these wealthy landlords, they do quite well for themselves, whereas there's overall deterioration for the peasants, and we'll get to this momentarily. All right, so if we look at the world grain markets, so it's not just rice that the Koreans are producing, but they're largely producing rice and other grains. In the 1910s and into the 20s, the majority of Korean rice is being exported to Japan. So, in fact, Koreans didn't really consume white rice during the colonial period because it was expensive. Most of it was being exported abroad or being sent to Japan. And so we see that they're eating other more inferior grains like barley. But in 1929, the international rice market collapses. And this means that many of these poor farmers, they were just wiped out because let's say that you are paying your rents, but you've had to take out loans in order to pay your rents. Once the rice market collapses, then you cannot pay back these loans, and so then your land is confiscated. So we see an exacerbation of the class divisions in Korea after 1929. So what is it that happened in 1929? What happened that had a worldwide effect in 1929? We'll get to this in a moment, but this was the stock market collapse in 1929. If we look at the ideological structure of the colonial period, the Japanese, they preserved the many Confucian values, such as loyalty to the empire, loyalty to it used to be one's king, but now it is to the Japanese emperor. The Japanese emperor is considered to be divine. There are these Japanese myths that the unbroken line of Japanese emperors, it can be traced all the way back to the sun goddess. And so because there are these divine, godlike origins of the imperial family, the Japanese emperor is considered to be divine. This is a part of the Japanese Shinto worship, where the emperor is also worshipped in Shinto worship because he has these divine origins. And so this idea of Confucian loyalty to one's king or one's ruler is then shifted from the Korean king to the Japanese emperor. And this fits in very nicely with the ideological structure. And so we see this inculcated in Koreans in the colonial educational system, where there is the imperial rescript on education, and all school children during the colonial period, they must repeat these. It's kind of like the Pledge of Allegiance in America, where you pledge your loyalty to the Japanese emperor. All right, so as we go through the beginning of the colonial period, during the first phase, the first 1/3 of the colonial period, this is the time where World War I breaks out. And Japan declares war on Germany on August 23rd, 1914. Why did they do this? Well, it's because Germany had some very strategic occupied territory of China's that they wanted. And so they declare war on Germany, and then they take they overtake those territories where Germany was, and they kick the Germans out. And then they submit the 21 demands to China, which is basically a way of bullying China. Because at this point, China is at the end of, we have the end of the Qing dynasty, and it is falling apart. The Japanese are able to expand their influence on the Chinese mainland. They're also able to start acquiring territories in the Pacific, and these again were previous territories owned by Germany. So at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. And in this treaty, basically the European countries blamed Germany for starting the war. And so they punish Germany by signing this Treaty of Versailles, where Germany has to accept the blame. They have to pay about $31.5 billion in reparations. And so in 1919 times, so remember this is 100 years ago, This is an astronomical amount of money, and in fact was completely unrealistic, and there was no way that the Germans would ever be able to pay back this amount of money. They had to make territorial concessions. They had to cut their army to 100,000 men. They only had 6 battleships, and so they were demilitarized. So this is what we see happening at the end of World War I. And we're going to go into in a little bit later what the significance of this was, and how it affected how German development progressed, and the direction in which Germany progressed, and then how this had international implications. All right, so at the end of World War I and around the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, he declared the 14 points. And this was in order to try to influence what was happening in Europe and the peace treaties in Europe. Now, with the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is where Germany had tried to expand its territories, the U.S. was really concerned with the former colonies. So, places that were in these regions here, and wanted to make sure that these former areas would be given their full independence. And this was because Wilson was interested in breaking up these former empires in Europe. And so he declared the 14 points, and one of these 14 points included self-determination, the principle of self-determination, that these former states should be given the right to establish their own independent governments. Well, the Koreans heard about this and they thought, oh, well, this also applies to us. We also should be this principle of self-determination should be applied to us, and we should also be given independence. And so the Koreans hoped that the Americans would support any kind of independence movements in Korea. So what we have is, during this time, there are various groups that are fighting or advocating for Korean independence from Japan, and they range in their ideas about how this independence can be achieved. But what happens in 1919, at the beginning of 1919, is that Go-jong dies. And so because Go-jong dies, there is a state funeral that is scheduled. So there will be a state funeral in Seoul, and all Koreans can come up from different parts of the country in order to pay their respects to their former king. Now, during the colonial period, especially at this time, Koreans were not allowed to gather in groups of more than 3 people. And this is precisely because the Japanese colonial state was worried that if you have more than 3 Koreans gathering, then they're going to hold a demonstration, and they're going to fight for independence. And so in order to avoid that, they said, if you gather in more than in groups larger than 3 people, then you need to have permission from the colonial state. Well, Go-jong's funeral was the first exception to this rule. So the Japanese were going to allow more, these large crowds to come up to Seoul and to pay their respects to their king. So the funeral was scheduled for March 3rd, 1919. And in a preemptive move, independence activists, they plan the Declaration of Independence of Korea on March 1st. So on March 1st, several of these independence leaders, they gather in a restaurant in downtown Seoul. They read the Declaration of Korean Independence. They call the or the Japanese colonial police. They say, we've declared the independence of Korea, so the police come and arrest them. Well, at the same time, there were coordinated events to also read the Declaration of Korean Independence. And so we see a crowd gathering at Pagoda Park, as well as at other areas around the country, and they read the Declaration of Independence at the same time at 2 p.m. And this ends up being a countrywide independence movement where over 1 million Koreans participate in this. And the Japanese did not see this coming. And so with this movement spreading through all different areas of the country, with so many people participating in it, this really concerns the Japanese colonial state. And so they overreact to these localized independence movements throughout the country, and they are brutally put down by the Japanese police and the army. So what occurs then is that resistance to the Japanese colonial state and these independence fighters, they need to move outside of Korea. There are still some that stay within Korea, but because now the Japanese realize, oh, this is a serious movement, they really clamp down. And they have, all of these colonial police to surveil independence activities. So a lot of these resistance movements move outside of Korea. And they go to Manchuria, they go to China, they go to Russia, and they form what are called these righteous armies, where they are fighting against the Japanese imperialist forces. But it is while they are in these areas like Manchuria, China, and Russia that they are exposed to communist ideologies. And so they become radicalized as they are in these areas, because communism is, in fact, anti-imperialist. And because they are anti-imperialist, this is extremely attractive to these independence activists. So we see them organizing their independence activities in these other regions, while at the same time learning about communist ideology and becoming radicalized. This is supposedly the time where we see the emergence of Kim Il-sung. So the idea or the mythology of Kim Il-sung is that he had relocated to Manchuria, where he was fighting against the Japanese imperialist armies, and so he was this anti-Japanese independence fighter, and fighting as a part of these righteous armies against the colonial state for Korean independence, and then later on goes to Russia in order to be educated in Marxist ideology. So this is about the time where we begin to see the beginnings, or let me say, the mythology of Kim Il-sung has its beginnings around this time. All right, so after the March 1st movement, there was also a provisional government that was established. This is an interim government representing the country or the nation of Korea, and it was established in Shanghai. Syngman Rhee, who would later on go on to become the first president of South Korea, he was involved in this, as well as a variety of Koreans from across the political spectrum from the left to the right. But the political differences eventually become too great, and it becomes run and controlled by the conservatives. There were also many resistance groups based in the United States. So Syngman Rhee, who had immigrated to the US and educated out there, he was advocating for Korean independence, but he believed that Korean independence could only be achieved with the help of a foreign power, namely the United States. There were others like An Chang-ho, who was also based in the US and was fighting for Korean independence, but he believed that Koreans were not quite ready and that independence had to be achieved gradually. Whereas Pang Yong-man said, forget that, the only way that we're going to get Korean independence back is if we fight for it. So he tried to establish a military academy and a Air Force Academy in the US in order to train fighters to send over to Korea to fight against the Japanese. Now, none of these were successful in achieving Korean independence, but at least after the March 1st movement, were able to keep the hope of independence alive. Of course, though, there were also supporters of the Japanese Empire. Not everybody was an independence fighter, but there were those who were outright supporters and worked with the Japanese colonial state or became part of the Japanese colonial police force. And then there's everything in between, right? Those who just were your regular Korean colonial subjects and were going along with the system because that was how things were. We see that the Japanese colonial state, they tried to increase their control during the wartime years, not World War I, but World War II. And really needed to call for wartime unity during World War II. And so we see this taking place in the form of the name order, where Koreans are forced to change their Korean names to Japanese names. And this is something that is still a source of real great resentment and bitterness on the part of Koreans against the Japanese. But this didn't occur until the end of the colonial period. All right, so we're going to stop here for part 1 of this lecture, and then stay tuned for part 2, where we will continue on and we're going to look, compare a bit with what is going on in China and then what happens at the end of the colonial period.